intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to be talking about a lot of issues in the news. And, of course, as always, welcoming your phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we've had a number of bombs exploding here in Texas, but those have all been in Austin. Now a device exploded in a FedEx building outside of San Antonio. Apparently, it injured one person, mostly having a ringing in the ears, but nevertheless, it is just, again, a question as to whether or not that was another one of these bombs that was headed to Austin or whether it's headed elsewhere. And it's, of course, made all of us that receive packages at our home or at our offices a little more edgy, and so I thought I would mention that. We've really not talked about this on the program, but maybe as we have more information, we'll get into that because it, of course, relates to those of us that live in the state of Texas. But there was also a school shooting today, but it ended in a much different way. This particular article that came out earlier said 3 people were injured this morning in a shooting at Great Mills High School in Maryland. Of course, now, since that has come out, one of those individuals is dead. That's the shooter. But as you read through here, the story tells you about it's not clear how many injuries there were, how people were affected. You have comments from not only the governor, but Steny Hoyer, who is the House whip and an individual that actually represents this area, goes through, talks about the police and everything. Something missing from the story. Why was the shooter shot? And this, I think, is something you might want to pay attention to as you see the news reports today. Number one, will we name the shooter? I hope that we don't. We don't here at Point of View. But we will also explain why he is no longer living. And that's because the school resource officer brought him down. Now, if you have been paying any attention, and I don't know if I mentioned this on the air, sometimes I'm going to mention something on the air or don't, but there were a number of teachers in the state of Maryland that said if we were to allow teachers to arm themselves, some of the teachers said, we will leave. Some of them said, we don't even want armed resource officers in our school. Maybe this will change their mind. I don't know. But this situation could have been very different if it weren't for the fact that the school resource officer was armed. And this is a conversation we've had around this table many times, and it's something I thought we would get into today. We've posted a couple of articles, which we'll get to later, not in this segment, but shortly thereafter. One is entitled 8 Stubborn Facts on Gun Violence in America. And then another one, 6 Reasons Gun Control Will Not Solve Mass Killings. Both of these come from John Malcolm and Amy Swirer, and these are individuals that work with the Heritage Foundation. John Malcolm actually is one of the vice presidents there, works on kind of constitutional issues, but he's taken the time, first of all, to pull together not just these statements, but then under each one of them, there's anywhere from sometimes 8 to 10 different statements, many of which actually have links, so that if you say, okay, they say that, but is that really true? They say this about where the murders take place. They say, for example, one of the statistics, which we mentioned last Friday on the program, I think Penna Dexter was the one that mentioned it, that over 50% of the murders that take place in America happen within only 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. So when you start looking at where the murders take place, there are, if you will, murder hotspots, and there are other places where murder is very, very rare indeed. And, of course, that's just murders through all sorts of things. But then if you focus in on gun-related homicides, Again, you have something that I think is very striking. So the point I'm making is that as we go through this, if you find yourself saying, I don't know, I got to see that for myself. I really need to check that out to determine whether I really accept that. Well, again, it will point you to those particular articles. And because we have them on our website, you can read those, you can download those, you can print them off, you can pass them on to others. You can take some of those points, make them Facebook posts or Twitter tweets or something you might want to put on Pinterest or Instagram or Snapchat or something of that nature. But let's, if we can, mention just briefly also what we covered yesterday, and that was the firing of FBI Director Andrew McCabe. That happened because the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, did so. And I thought I'd read just a short piece before we go to a break here that comes from Gary Bauer, because he said that left-wing commentators have insisted that President Donald Trump was responsible for the firing of Andrew McCabe. He said that is beyond fake news. It is a lie. Andrew McCabe, he said, is responsible for the firing of Andrew McCabe. The Independent Office of Professional Responsibility determined that McCabe lacked candor during testimony before Congress and during interviews with the Inspector General's office. Gary Bauer says it this way: this is deep state speak for he lied. That was the determination of career bureaucrats at the Justice Department. The Office of Professional Responsibility has been led by Candace Will since her appointment in 2004 by then FBI Director Robert Mueller, and the Justice Department Inspector General was appointed by Barack Obama. So to say that this was done by Donald Trump, I think is really reaching a great deal. And as we mentioned yesterday in the commentary that came from Al Perotto, he points out that the Office of Professional Responsibility recommends somebody be fired for not being candid about as often as a 16th seed beats a number 1 seed in March Madness, which, as we saw last weekend, does happen, but is very, very rare indeed. Goes on to talk about some of the other aspects of that as well. I might as well just finish that off, because he also says, Gary Bauer says, speaking of lying, in his statement defending himself, Andrew McCabe may have indicted James Comey in perjury. The second lie that was being promoted is that McCabe's firing was politicized. Jeff Flake, for example, senator from Arizona, who was stepping down, said McCabe's firing was a horrible day for democracy, and said to have firings like this happen to the top from the president, the attorney general, does not speak well for what's going on. Again, this didn't come from the top, so Flake has his facts wrong, says Gary Bauer. Moreover, the Obama presidency was full, he says, of horrible days for our democracy. The Obama administration weaponized our intelligence agencies and other government bureaucrats against the Trump campaign and conservatives. Andrew McCabe was a part of that particular effort. So if nothing else, that is the case. And one other argument that has been cited is that because he was fired just days before he qualified for the full and very generous federal pension at the age of 50. By the way, don't you wish you could retire at the age of 50? I'm way past that. That's been in the rearview mirror for a long time. Numerous sources over the weekend say that Andrew McCabe is probably worth about $11 million on his $162,000 salary. He must have done well in the stock market. That's tongue-in-cheek, because I got a feeling there were some other ways in which he made his money. No doubt he'll announce a book deal, and it's not like he doesn't receive a pension. He just doesn't receive all that he might have been able to. Of course, some members of Congress right now, as we mentioned yesterday, are talking about maybe they will hire him just for a few days so he could qualify for his pension. And just think about that, because the contrast that we always like to use is Michael Flynn, who's been on the program before, who, because he has not been able to really afford this, has he's mortgaged his house. I think he's going to sell his house. But just imagine if a conservative member of Congress said, we'll just hire Michael Flynn. You can hear the hue and cry. But here, members of Congress are thinking about hiring Andrew McCabe so he gets his full, generous government pension. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Now playing. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, in just a few minutes, we're going to get into some of the articles we've posted here, some of the reasons for the fact that gun control will not solve mass killings, and also some of the stubborn facts on gun violence in America. And if you'd like to follow along, those articles are on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But I thought I'd hit one other issue I talked about yesterday in this hour, and that is the outstanding success that has come from this new movie, I Can Only Imagine. And this has now actually caught the attention not only of people in the Christian world, but also in worlds that look at certain kinds of films. And this article that is posted in IndieWire, I Can Only Imagine, might not be March's only faith-based box office surprise hit. Well, that's for sure, because this last Sunday, my Sunday school class went to I Can Only Imagine. This Sunday, we're going to the new movie that is coming out dealing with the Gospel of Luke and all of that. And so I thought for just a minute I'd read just a portion of this. You can, of course, find it in a number of different venues. But the writer, Kate Erblin, said, faith-based filmmaking isn't dead. While the genre has struggled recently to turn out crossover hits, and nothing has topped the $611 million from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Still, it's the top earner in 14 years after its release for this genre. But nevertheless, the brothers Andrew and John Irwin, and we've talked about the Irwin brothers here on Point of View before, their latest hit, I Can Only Imagine, surprised this week's box office with $17 million on that opening and put it number 3 in a crowded field. Among contemporary community Titles Only Heaven Is for Real had a better opening, which was $22 million. Other faith-based films have faltered at the box office, making the success of I Can Only Imagine, making it very successful indeed. But she does go on to mention a few others. Heaven for Real, War Room did extremely well, and some others. So, as a matter of fact, I can tell she isn't necessarily sympathetic to some of the Christian message because she refers to some of these as controversial. And I guess from a secular point of view, that is the case. But nevertheless, in just one weekend, I Can Only Imagine has nearly cracked the top 20 of all Christian films released since 1980. It may soon have some other competition, though, because in the lead up, you have about 5 other Christian films on the docket this year. So the one that a lot of us will be seeing this coming weekend, and we've also been talking about, if you've heard some of the spots here for Point of View, is Sony's Columbia Films, which is Paul the Apostle of Christ. Now, interestingly enough, that is only going to open in about 1,400 theaters, which I think is a mistake. Even I Can Only Imagine open in 1,600 theaters. This one actually is less. It's getting a great deal of visibility. It's played, interestingly enough, by Jim Caviezel, who plays Luke, and then James Faulkner plays Paul. And again, this is, I think, because a lot of people know who Jim Caviezel was because he's the one that played Jesus in The Passion for the Christ. I think that's going to come off pretty well. But if nothing else, you can see that we also have another God's Not Dead, A Light in the Darkness. That's part of Pure Flix. And we've talked about this before. This new film, it says, will follow an entire congregation who struggles after its church is burned down. The first film, released in 2014, pulled in $65 million in total ticket sales, with, again, a $2 million budget. And so you have that and then a variety of others, which I won't go into. But the point I'm making is that is starting to get the attention of Hollywood, and I think that's a good thing. If you've ever listened to me talk about this before, oftentimes we try to do interviews with some of the actors, the directors, and others whenever we can. We do some spots to encourage you to go out there because, number one, what this does is it sends a signal to Hollywood and to other filmmakers that there is an audience out there for good faith-based films that have a good story. There have been some faith-based films that haven't done well because they didn't have a good story. They didn't have a redemptive story. I Can Only Imagine as a great story of redemption, and anybody you know that is a strained relationship with a father and a mother or a friend, this is really very powerful indeed in terms of forgiveness. Of course, it's the whole backstory of how the lead singer there for Mercy Me actually wrote the song, I Can Only Imagine, after his father's death. And so, again, you will certainly benefit from that. So I think this is a good thing. And also, as we mentioned yesterday, if you look at our friends at Movie Guide, Ted Baer actually did an analysis this last year and evaluated those films that did very well and those that made, on average, $50 million or more, either had a Christian theme or at least had a good redemptive moral theme. Those that did not did much worse, about $11 million per theater, or showing, I should say. And those that were really very strongly humanistic or anti-Christian, they made $1 million. So it doesn't take long to begin to realize that the market has always been for the G and PG rated films that have a family basis. Many of them have a faith basis, and even not, they have a redemptive story. And those others are a little bit different. You know, they're good, kind of art house kind of movies, and they're done so that you get a pat on the back because you're edgy, because you took on a controversial issue, and then hopefully you'll get some kind of nomination, if not an award from the Academy. But they aren't the ones that pay the freight. It's still the Christian community out there and the non-Christian community just looking for good films to go to that still want to go to some of those films. So, again, I thought I'd mention that now we're starting to see other people understanding how significant this I Can Only Imagine film did this last weekend. Most were predicting about $3 million. It made $17 million. It actually, on Friday night, repaid the film. So it is pure income for John Irwin and Andrew Irwin. I wish the Irwin brothers well, and let's get more good films from them in the future. Let's, if we can, get into some of these issues of gun violence and mass killings. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And I might just mention that in the past we've posted a couple of other articles, one in particular that comes from David French, who was in the studio with us just a couple of weeks ago, wrote, first, a long essay in The Atlantic, where he was just trying to explain to people that aren't really used to being around guns. He now lives in Tennessee, but having gone to Harvard and having been in the Northeast and having been around a lot of people that have never been around a pickup truck, never been around a gun, don't understand gun culture, never been to a gun range, never been into a gun store. He was just trying to explain, kind of what that means and maybe kill a few of the stereotypes that people have. Well, what happened is that all sorts of people wrote really nasty, snarky kinds of letters to the editor when it showed up on, of course, the internet, then all sorts of posts. And he began to realize that even though he was trying to destroy stereotypes, there are just a lot of people that just wouldn't listen. And so he titled this piece that came out recently, Why the Left Won't Win the Gun Control Debate, and points out the three arguments that he always hears. Argument number one is that you should never base your decision to buy a gun, because he talks about eventually deciding to get a gun because of the threat to his wife and him. And they said, well, you should never base it on fear. I said, really? When you put on a seatbelt, it's not a horrible fear, but it's a reasonable fear that if you were in an accident, buckling your seatbelt would be a good idea. Or if you ride a motorcycle, wouldn't you want to have a helmet? And would you really ride a motorcycle without a helmet just to show that you're not scared? Unfortunately, I know some people that do. The second one that he points out is that you're foolish. Either you're fearful, or the other F is you're foolish, because you're more likely to hurt yourself than to defend yourself, as the argument goes. Now, he points out statistically, and we're going to get into this in the second half of this hour, but let me just mention that he points out that even when you include suicides in that analysis, you still compare that to the estimates of annual defensive gun use, and you'll find that law-abiding Americans use guns to defend themselves far more than they do to hurt themselves. And if you really take out the suicides, it's not even a close race. So first of all, fear, then foolishness. Finally, there's the concession that, all right, maybe you need a gun, but you don't need that gun. You don't need that rifle. You don't need a semi-automatic gun. And, of course, he just says, again, these arguments fall apart when you just think about who might be coming in that door. It's a burglar. It's a mugger, or it might be what? It could be a terrorist. What are they going to have in their hands? Well, they're not going to have a musket. They're not going to have a breech-loading weapon, which is the argument. They say, well, that was back in the 18th century. No, they're going to have what? A high-capacity magazine, either in a handgun or a rifle. If you don't have the same, guess what? And as I've said on this program a number of times before, and even in this column and commentary and booklet we all have coming out, that's one of the reasons police officers don't use revolvers much anymore, because they will want to have the same kind of ability to defend themselves and the people they're trying to defend with weapons comparable to those of the bad guys. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters March 23rd. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk a little bit about gun violence and gun control. And these next two segments, we'll kind of focus on the articles we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention that one of the things we do for individuals that support us on a regular basis is that we provide them with all sorts of benefits. Those, for example, that join what is called the Truth Team. That's as little as $1 a day, $30 a month. They receive all sorts of benefits. We'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks again when we do our push. One of those, of course, is we send the Outlook magazine to them, and these cover all sorts of very important issues. But for people that support us at just a little bit higher level, since Point of View has been around for 45 years, we have a $45 level, and we in addition to including all sorts of other resources, have these booklets. We've produced ones on Sharia law, the politicized culture, making your vote count, homosexuality, and the issue of homosexual theology, privacy and surveillance. And the next one coming out is on the Second Amendment. And certainly, if you would want to join with us at that level, you'll receive every one of those in the mail every single month. But I might just mention that even if you would like to just receive that booklet on the Second Amendment, it will be a great resource to supplement some of the things I'm going to be talking about now from these articles that we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. So if you make a donation, just ask for that booklet that is just now coming out on the Second Amendment, and it will give you a very good understanding of some of the court cases, the whole issue of gun control, the issue of self-defense, and much more. So let me just, again, encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, and to find both of these articles. And the first one we'll look at is 8 Stubborn Facts for Gun Violence in America. And as you go there, if you want to make a donation and ask for that Second Amendment booklet, we would certainly be glad to send it to you. I'll try to go through all 8 fairly quickly, but as I mentioned before, under each one of these points, there are, well, in one of these only 5, but in most of these anywhere from about 8 to 10 sub-points with all sorts of references. But the first point that they make in terms of gun violence is that America is relatively safe and the trend is becoming safer. That's because even though we've seen some of the number of these school shootings going up somewhat, we see that when you look at the National Crime Victimization Survey, violent crime has been decreasing steadily, really since the 1990s. The homicide rate, for example, in 2011 is almost half of what it was in 1991. And so we are starting to see that the number of non-fatal firearm crimes is about 1/6 the number it was back in 1993. And even in the largest cities, it's decreased somewhat. So if anything, what we're seeing is that if we hear stories about gun violence, one death is one too many. I'm not trying to minimize that, but at the same time, if you want to look at the trend has really been going down. It's popped up just a tad in the last year or two, but it has certainly dropped really significantly since the 1990s. And we can talk about all the reasons if you want to, but let me get on to the second point. First of all, the violent crime rate is going down and has been on a decline for decades. The second point is that the principal public safety concerns are suicides and illegally owned handguns. Turns out that when you start looking at those gun deaths, whenever you see a number for the annual gun deaths, here's something that will help you to be a wise and discerning reader or viewer or listener. Almost 2/3 of those annual gun deaths are suicides. Again, one suicide is too many, but again, when people talk about killing or being killed, we are killing ourselves at very significant numbers, and that has really nothing to do with guns other than that's a more convenient way for people to kill themselves. I have friends, unfortunately, that have committed suicide, some from drug overdoses, one just jumping off of a parking garage, one hanging himself, a variety of others. As a matter of fact, most of the suicides I know have not come at the hands of guns, although I do know one because we had a guest in studio here that talked about his wife obtaining a gun and then killing herself in the parking lot. But that is pretty rare for my personal experience. But if you look at, again, these numbers, the bigger issue is suicides, then the other thing that we need to look at is, again, these illegally owned handguns, the individuals who indeed were using those, and in many cases, those were obtained illegally. It's not an individual that goes in there, gets a background check, and then goes out and perpetrates a crime. Many times they are not even eligible. So instead, it is individuals who actually obtain those firearms illegally. Let's get on to the third point. The small number of factors significantly increase the likelihood that a person will be a victim of gun-related homicide. And that is, first of all, where you live. You heard me say in the last segment that over 50% of the murders occur in 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. Moreover, gun-related homicides are heavily concentrated even in certain neighborhoods in those counties. I can show you some places where you are pretty safe to have never been murdered, and I could, hopefully with an armed guard, take you to some places where your likelihood of being killed has increased significantly simply because of the location of where you are. Another thing is not only where you live, but who is your partner. According to some of the most recent articles, this one comes from the Hastings Law Journal. That, by the way, is a very liberal law journal because it is the law school of the University of California at Berkeley, found that, again, the people recently or currently involved in abusive, intimate relationships are much more likely to be victims of gun-related homicides than the rest of the population, especially if the abuser owns firearms. So again, where you live, who you know, who you're related to, are you in a gang? Well, again, you can see the number, the significant percentages of homicides that are gang-related, and you can go down this long list that is provided by John Malcolm. Let's go on to our fourth point. The perpetration of gun-related murders is often carried out by predictable people. And that should not be surprising because if you look at this, almost all the mass public shooters have extensive histories of mental health issues, whether they're delusional, whether they've had psychiatric treatment, whether they've struggled with depression or anxiety. Certainly some of them have had disturbing behaviors and interpersonal violence. So again, that one I think is so intuitively obvious. I'll move on to the next one. And that is number 5. The higher rates of gun ownership are not associated with higher rates of violence. That's best illustrated, of course, by the provocative title by John Lott, who's been on the program with us many times before. The title of his book, More Guns, Less Crime. And that is the case that when you look at some of the places where you've had the highest rates of gun ownership, sometimes you have the lowest crime rate. The higher rates of concealed carry permit holders also can be correlated with a reduction in violent crime than in other states. Again, correlation doesn't always prove causation, but let's use a little bit of common sense here. If you are breaking into a home and you know that this particular area is full of individuals that have concealed carry, you are a lot more fearful of what you might encounter when you break down that door than in a place which you know is a gun-free zone. Number 6, there's no clear relationship between strict gun control legislation and homicide or violent crime rates. Goes through the Crime Prevention Research Center and shows that, if anything, there seems to be, as I mentioned just a minute ago, sometimes something very different. Gun control legislation sometimes actually seems to have an inverse effect in terms of raising some of the crime rates. And then legally owned firearms are used for lawful purposes much more than they are often used to commit crimes or suicide. Lots of statistics there, which I just mentioned a minute ago. These come from a variety of different stories, a variety of different collected data, a lot of which, interestingly enough, comes from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, because President Barack Obama ordered the CDC to actually begin to pull together that research. And they found some of the same things that John Lott had found for years. And then number 8, concealed carry permit holders are not the problem. They may actually be the solution. And as I mentioned before, John Lott has found that as a group, concealed carry permit holders are some of the most law-abiding people in America. The rate at which they commit crimes generally is between 1/6 and 1/10 of that recorded for police officers who are themselves committing crimes at a fraction of the rate of the general population. So because you have to go through some kind of background checks and self-selection process, actually, if you know somebody's a concealed carry holder, you probably know that they're pretty law-abiding, and they're probably the kind of people that you would like to have in your store. Nevertheless, a lot of stores will post no concealed carry permit holders in the store. I think they're making a mistake, but those are at least 8 stubborn facts on gun violence in America. We'll come back and talk about some reasons gun control will not solve mass killings right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. News out of Alaska reports that officials on the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly are thinking of ending their practice of prayer prior to their meetings. Assembly member Sean Tackey has said that the move to end pre-meeting prayer is to be inclusive. Since some of the community believe in prayer before meetings and others don't, he says, quote, having a strict policy of separation of church and state excludes no one and includes everyone, unquote. I'm not sure that's the right logic. By excluding legislative prayer, the Assembly is excluding those who believe in such prayers while favoring those who insist upon strict secularity in the public square. To quote Justice Kennedy's majority opinion in Grease versus Galloway, government may not mandate a civic religion that stifles any but the most generic reference to the sacred any more than it may prescribe a religious orthodoxy, unquote. The Supreme Court of the United States has twice explained legislative prayers have a long history and tradition in our country, a tradition meant to lend gravity to the proceedings while acknowledging the role religion plays in the life of our nation. Legislative bodies like this assembly may choose to end their practice of legislative prayer, but they should understand that nothing in the history of our country or the doctrine of our Constitution compels them to do so. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, and let me just mention that next hour, if you would join us, we're going to be talking with Anthony DiStefano, Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. We're going to be talking about the so-called new atheist. He also has a piece that came out in Fox News, a commentary. Today's atheists are bullies, and they are doing their best to intimidate the rest of us into silence. They're going to be talking about atheism, especially the so-called new atheism. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, when he was alive, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, those kind of people. And then I know that if you're listening on the local Dallas station, you won't be able to hear the third hour, but you can certainly listen to it online. We have Michelle Rigby Assad, and she is the author of the book Breaking Cover, My Secret Life in the CIA and What It's Taught Me About What's Worth Fighting For. And here is an individual that was a former undercover officer for the National Clandestine Service of the CIA, trained as a counter-terrorist specialist and served her country for 10 years, working in Iraq and other places in the Middle East, which we cannot let you know about. And I think you're going to really appreciate that. You won't be able to hear that on this station, but you can certainly listen online. Or, of course, don't forget, you can go to our Facebook Live broadcast and see and watch it there as well. Just before we run out of time, let me now take the second article. Both of these articles, again, are available to you. The first one I just read from, and I was really just giving you a cursory summary of some great material that is in this particular article, 8 Stubborn Facts for Gun Violence in America. But now let me get to the other one, 6 Reasons Gun Control Will Not Solve Mass Killings. And the first of those 6 is mass killings are rare, and mass public shootings are rarer still. So again, even though they've increased, and I will acknowledge that, and this weekend in Washington, D.C., we're going to hear about, shootings are up. Well, they are. But mass killings are still very rare. They account for 0.2% of the homicides each year and about 1% of the homicide victims. Again, 1 death is too many, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But again, we are focusing an enormous amount of time and attention on something that is rare, and I would certainly appreciate the attention on these mass killings if we'd also spend at least a significant amount of time on the other areas of gun violence in many of the inner cities where people are being killed at such an incredible rate, and we hardly ever hear about that. But that's the first point. Mass killings are rare, and mass public shootings are even rarer. Number 2, many gun control measures are not likely to be helpful. And this is the statistic that you've seen so many times. And again, there's an HTML link there so you can go to the research studies, which I think well documented and really above reproach, that over 90% of the public mass shootings take place in gun-free zones where civilians are not permitted to carry firearms. Last time we had John Lott in with us, he pointed out that the shooter in Colorado, remember, he went into that theater and shot those people. But we can go back and look at first his diary. I also document the diary of the one that went into that church on the eastern seaboard. And in both cases, you can see that they were, in their writings and in their experience, bypassing places where people might have had a weapon, going to a place that is obviously a gun-free zone. As I've said before, some of these people may be delusional. They may be, as we hate to use the word, crazy, but they're not always stupid, and they go to places that are gun-free zones. 6 out of every 10 mass public shootings are carried out by handguns alone, while only 1 in 10 with a rifle alone. Of course, we've seen a couple of those, Orlando, of course, the most recent one here in Parkland. Again, the average age, what individuals are done, how they were killed, all that is in this as well. But again, the second point, many gun control measures are not likely to be helpful. Number 3, public mass shooters typically have histories of mental health issues. Again, you've got to be careful. Just because somebody has a mental health issue doesn't mean they're a potential shooter. But according to at least one study, 60% of these mass public shooters had been diagnosed with a mental disorder or had demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. And then it goes into some of the other issues of the links between untreated psychiatric illnesses and the rest. But in interest of time, let me get my last couple here. Number 4, the United States does not have an extraordinarily high problem with mass public shootings compared with other countries. You would think that that would be the case because we have much more population than, say, Belgium has or that France has. And so when you hear one of those, they seem somewhat rare, but when you start doing some kind of evaluation, casualties per capita, I hate to even think about those kind of statistics, but there are people that pull those together. You can see that the United States is not an outlier like you would be told sometimes by people in the press. Number 5, mass killers often find ways to kill even without firearms. And it is intriguing to see this list, and I won't read these in the interest of time, but the way people have been killed in other countries through car ramming, stabbing, bombings, of course, plane crashes, all sorts of other things, to realize that if you even could get rid of all the guns, they have in places, especially a lot of these come from China, but some come from places like Belgium, France, Germany, other places as well. They'll find somewhere else, and they'll find some other way to bring about their lethal intent. And number 6, Australia did not eliminate mass public shootings by banning assault weapons, because we've been told before, first by the president, now by a number of other individuals and members of Congress, say, we need to follow the policies, and we need to adopt the policies, and we need to follow the lead of Australia, because they actually put together a National Firearms Act, which involved a lot more than just no longer allowing assault weapons to be produced. It actually allowed for a great deal of collecting of those kinds of weapons as well. And confiscation of weapons is not something I think the American people are going to go for anyway. But the reality is that when you go back and look at some of the statistics, even though we are told that this is the way to solve mass shootings, because Australia really led the way with their National Firearms Act, even when they no longer allowed for the production and distribution of some of the weapons, even the confiscation of some of the weapons didn't turn out to be quite as successful as many people would say. If you say, I got to read this for myself, this is very different than what I've heard the mainstream press talk about. That's why we posted both of these articles. It's available at pointofview.net. And if you find errors in that, I would be glad to point those out to John Malcolm and the people at Heritage Foundation. But most of what I've seen them quoting are the very reputable statistics, some of which have been collected by the Centers for Disease Control, others by the FBI and others, and look for them yourself and come to your own conclusion. We're going to take a break. When we come back, as I mentioned, I'm going to change topics. Anthony DiStefano, Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, if you would like to receive this booklet that we have made available, or if you'd even like to receive some of the other booklets on Sharia law and on voting and on all sorts of other issues, feel free to go to the website, pointofview.net, and you'll see a place that says Donate Now. And if you would make a donation, ask as you make that donation to get one of those booklets, I'd be glad to send it to you, just as a thank you for your gift to this ministry. And I hope some of you might even think about supporting us on a regular basis. Our bills come in on a regular basis, so if our donations come in on a regular basis, that makes our life a lot easier as well. All of it available at the website, pointofview.net. Lots of free articles, but if you'd like to make a donation, do that as well, pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to talk about the rise of the so-called new atheist mindset, and we're going to talk about a variety of issues, the arrogance and even the ignorance of some of the atheists. All that coming up right after this.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment comes I Can Only Imagine. The untold true story of Mercy Me's Bart Millard and the power of redemption and forgiveness.
My dad was a monster, and I saw God transform him. I didn't think that God could do that.
I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now playing. More information is available at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
When you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living on a different planet from those presenting the headlines? We've always known there was a subtle bias, but today, it's about as subtle as stepping off a 1,000-foot cliff. The only way to counteract that bias is with the truth. To join the Truth Team at Point of View, your support will educate and encourage potentially millions every day. Don't let lies win. Step up so that lives and our nation can be changed. Join the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Topic this hour is the so-called new atheist, a conversation we've occasionally had in the past, but we are going to do it again because of a couple of reasons. First of all, the book we're going to be talking about, Inside the Atheist Mind, written by Anthony DiStefano, who also has written a piece that you can find in a number of venues. FoxNews.com is one place where you can find it. Today's atheists are bullies, and they are doing their best to intimidate the rest of us into silence. New book out called Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. Anthony DiStefano, a best-selling author. You probably know him from A Travel Guide to Heaven, A Travel Guide to Life, 10 Prayers God Always Says Yes To, Angels All Around Us, and much, much more. Anthony, welcome to Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Looking forward to this. We've appreciated your writing, and this is going to be a little different because I love how you start the book.
Right.
If you're an atheist, this book is really not for you. There are a lot of good books that really try to convince you that God exists, if indeed that would be the case. Even if you're an agnostic, you know, there are a lot of books that will probably help you in one way or another kind of begin to think through your possible faith or your lack of faith. This one is not really for atheists, it's about atheists. And your argument is, and I sometimes agree with that since I've been involved in debates with atheists, sometimes we have to be nice and gracious, but not always, not when somebody's a bully. Sometimes you need to call them out. And that's kind of what your book's about, isn't it?
That's exactly what it's about. I mean, I am sick and tired of these atheist bullies and their vicious blogs and articles and books and billboard campaigns that they put up at Easter time and Christmas with the most obscenely offensive messages. Christians are not punching bags. We're not doormats, and we can fight back. And not only that, we have to fight back. I say at the beginning of this book, it's time, that I'm not going to turn the other cheek. Our Lord wants us to turn the other cheek in terms of not taking grievances personally, not reacting out of pride. But we must always fight against injustice. We must always fight against evil. And we have to fight against these new atheists because they are just, it's getting to epidemic proportions, and they are just attacking Christians every single day and in every way.
Well, and again, for just a minute, our Christian audience, they might say, well, I don't know. I mean, you just talked about turning the other cheek, but let's use the Apostle Paul, because here you see a good example. When the Apostle Paul is in, say, Acts 13, he's in the synagogue and he contends for the faith, and he is an able debater and really begins to set forth the gospel. But at the same time, he really challenges some of the Jews that you rejected the Messiah, you've turned against the faith, you've relied on the law when the law cannot save. So that's even in Acts 13. That we're not really in an Acts 13 world anymore. We're in an Acts 17 world. And in Acts 17, here the Apostle Paul finds himself with the pagan philosophers. And these are people that are kind of the great-great-great-great-great-grandparents of a variety of individuals like Christopher Hitchens, and certainly when he was alive, I should say, and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. And they're making fun of him. They're calling him names, and he really interacts with them as well. And so I would have to say that at a time when everybody was nice and everybody was at least having kind of a Christian memory, that's a strategy that works pretty well. But when you have people that are in your face making fun of you, criticizing you, actually vilifying you and preventing you from even having a chance to speak a biblical perspective on a college campus, maybe it's time to kind of raise the level of discussion and debate. Is that fair?
Oh, that's fair. In fact, you don't even have to go to St. Paul. Our Lord himself did it. When he saw the money changers in the temple, he didn't talk very nicely to them. He made a whip of cords and tossed them out of the temple. Or when the scribes and the Pharisees tried to trip him up with clever language, he put them in their place. He called them a brood of vipers, full of dead men's bones. I mean, there were times when he exercised righteous anger. And that's what we need to do right now, exercise a little righteous anger to stop these bullies.
Well, again, the book is just a phenomenal resource because about 170 pages, but then about 40 pages of endnotes. So if you find yourself saying, okay, Anthony said something, I'm not so sure about that, I got to check it out, you will find very well footnoted. But again, it talks about the arrogance of the atheist, the ignorance of the atheist, the ruthlessness of the atheist, the intolerance of the atheist, the shallowness of the atheist, the cowardice of the atheist, the death-centeredness of the atheist, the faithfulness of the atheist, the malevolence of the atheist, and the end of the atheist. Again, we probably won't cover all of it, but let's get into also the piece that came out today. Today's atheists are bullies, and they are doing their best to intimidate the rest of us into silence. You are already sort of alluded to that, but it does seem to me that we would, if we only listen to this atheist, assume that every one of the great leaders of the Western world, all the inventors of the scientific method, all the great philosophers would have had memberships in the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And that's not really the case, is it?
Not only is it not the case, it's completely opposite of the case. The ignorance of atheists today when it comes to history borders on insanity. That's how ignorant they are of history. When they think that Christianity has been the enemy of rational thinking, that it's been the enemy of art, that it's been the enemy of freedom, that it's been the enemy of peace. But if you look at history, you see the exact opposite is true. When you look at the greatest geniuses of history, for instance, you see that the overwhelming number have been Christian. I mean, or have believed in God in some way. Aristotle and Bacon and Newton, they all believed in some kind of a God. The father of bacteriology, the father of biology, the father of chemistry, the father of the scientific method, they all believed in God. Even the person who formulated the Big Bang theory, believe it or not, which atheists mistakenly think is evidence against God, was a Catholic priest, believe it or not, and the person who's the father of genetics was a monk. So the point is that when it comes to rational thinking, I mean the Christianity created the education system and the library system. They preserved all the philosophy from antiquity. When you talk about art, my goodness, we could spend all day long speaking about the the great art that Christians have produced. Michelangelo and Mozart and Beethoven and from every other field. And when you talk about freedom, Christianity believes that mankind is made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, we have infinite value. This is the foundation of limited government. All men are created equal. And indeed, Christians were behind, not atheists. Christians were the founders of this country. Most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were very committed Christians, for instance. Christians are the ones basically who were behind all the anti-slavery movements. Christians are the ones who elevated women. Before Christianity, women were considered property. The hospital system, the orphanage system, all the charities that we see around us, thousands and thousands of them, all Christian-based. And atheists just do not want to see it. It's like they're ostriches.
Well, again, that's one of the reasons for the book. It gives you some of that intellectual firepower. Come back and continue our conversation talking about this new book, Inside the Atheist Mind, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Now playing. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today with Anthony DiStefano. Again, the book is entitled Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. Book just came out, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, and it is published by Thomas Nelson, but we also have a link there in case you'd like to order it. You can get it in paperback, or you can get it in Kindle. And Anthony, for just a minute, let's talk about one of the things I hear oftentimes from my atheist friends, and that is, this world would be so much better if you religious people were not in it, if you weren't teaching religious dogma. We have these religious wars and we have all of this. But in your chapter 3, The Ruthlessness of the Atheist, when I look at the death toll just in the 20th century alone from atheistic regimes, I think my atheist friends are kidding themselves if they think that getting rid of religion is going to bring about a utopia. What do you think?
Well, you've hit on another one of their massive self-delusions, and that is that religion or belief in God or Christianity is the cause of more war and bloodshed than any other system of beliefs the world has ever known. This is absolute nonsense. Philip Axelrod's Encyclopedia of Wars catalogs every war that has taken place on record since 8000 BC, and he found that 6.9% of all wars were of a religious nature. And if you subtract Islam from the equation, then 3.2% of wars were caused by Christianity. That means 96% of all the wars on this country were for worldly reasons, like economic gain or territorial gain or civil wars or revolutionary wars. So how are they crying so hysterically about Christianity being the cause of bloodshed? The opposite is the case. What you just said is very true. In the last 100 years, over 150,000, a million human beings have been killed by atheist regimes. People like, Stalin and Mao Zedong and Pol Pot and Adolf Hitler. Hitler sometimes atheists ludicrously call a Christian, but he was not. He hated all religions. And his private diaries show that very, very clearly. So 150 million deaths on their hand just in the last 100 years. No wonder they don't like to look at history.
Let's get into another issue, and you have that in Chapter 4, and that is the intolerance of the atheist. Now, because I'm older than you, and just the other day we were doing a little special video in honor of Norm Geisler, and we used to do some of these debates with atheists back in the 70s and 80s. Of course, we still do now. I've done one recently. But I've noticed a difference. The atheists in the past used to say, well, we disagree with you, but all right, you got your view. It was kind of like intellectual apartheid. I think you Christians are kind of deluded, but if you want to believe that, fine. But we want to believe what we believe. But the new atheists are saying something very different, and that is the God delusion is a good example. Not only you deluded, you don't have a right to your views. You shouldn't teach them to your kids. And actually, you are very dangerous in society. So I've noticed that the new atheists have sort of ratcheted this up. Not that Bertrand Russell and some other atheists in the past weren't hostile to Christianity, but this intolerance towards any kind of religious faith seems to be somewhat new. What do you think?
It's new for the last century. It's new in this country. It's actually got its roots going back to Nietzsche and those before him,
sure,
who were very, very rabid. All it is that they've gotten a little power now, and now that they've gotten a little power, they're showing their true faces. I mean, you mentioned some of these people like Sam Harris. I mean, he let me give you a couple of these lines. Sam Harris, one of the leading atheists, said, "If I could wave a wand and rid the world of either rape or religion, I wouldn't hesitate to rid the world of religion." Bill Maher said, "All religions equally stupid and dangerous." Al Stefanelli, who's the head of American Atheists, one of the local chapters, he said, "Sometimes intolerance is necessary and even laudable when it's directed against dangerous ideas." That's what they think we are. We're dangerous. I mean, my book just came out today, and I had one article on Fox News, and there are 5,000 comments already, and overwhelmingly they are atheists who are mad and yelling and screaming and calling me all kinds of names. I mean, you don't see evangelical leaders using this kind of language. You don't see the Pope using this kind of language. You don't even see most Islamic leaders using it. But these atheists, though, are just filled with just rage.
Well, let's also point out something else. You go to Amazon right now and you'll see all the comments, or you'll see the ones at Fox News and those kinds of things. It's a sure bet they haven't seen the book. Now, I have in front of me what's called an advanced reader's copy, and I've gone through it. But the reality is they're reacting before they even know what's in the book. They're reacting to what is about a page and a half of commentary. So you can see, and that's the way the game's played. They go out of their way to try to tamp down anything that could possibly even be a critique of what they have to say. And yet, on the other hand, if, as you said, a Christian book comes out, or look at some of the mean-spirited things that were said, even of the death of Billy Graham, going back to maybe some of the others, we're just supposed to kind of turn the other cheek and say, well, that's just the way they are, and so we'll pray for them. But on the other hand, they're engaged in anything they can do to try to ruin your reputation and ruin your book sales simply because they don't like the possibility that you may have found a couple of weak points in their argument. And so before they've even read the book, they've already come out with these horrible kinds of critique.
Yes, they're proving the point in the book. The point of the book is that atheists are not engaged in any kind of rational thinking, that it's an intellectually bankrupt philosophy, and that atheists themselves are ignorant, arrogant, and bullies. And that's what they're doing. They're doing what bullies always do. They're throwing a temper tantrum like little babies. They're not talking about arguments. They're not arguing rationally at all. They're just reacting in a vicious, mean way. And I say let them. Let them jump and down and scream as much as they like.
Let me get one more point before we take a break, and then, of course, I'm going to open up the phones. Perhaps you have some comments, 1-800-351-1212. But one of your chapters is on the ignorance of atheists, another one on the shallowness of atheists. Alvin Plantinga, who's a Christian philosopher, one time when he was doing a critique of one of the writings by Richard Dawkins, said that really the philosophy being expressed by Richard Dawkins is sort of sophomoric, but that would be an offense to sophomores in high school or college. So in some respects, sometimes these are powerful arguments. Most of the time, they don't really stand the test of any kind of real scholarship, do they?
Not at all. They're completely intellectually shallow. They're full of non sequiturs and straw man arguments. In other words, they say, oh, the Bible disproves the existence of God because the Bible is wrong. Or evolution disproves the existence of God. Science disproves the existence of God. Bad Christians, hypocritical Christians disprove the existence of God. All of these non sequiturs. First of all, they don't disprove the existence of God. And second of all, when you say something like, oh, the Bible is wrong, obviously obviously, there's a big discussion there that needs to be had. They don't want to have that discussion about the Bible. So they'll just ridicule you and erect phony straw men, knock down the straw men, and claim victory. And meanwhile, they've won nothing.
Well, let me again mention that since the book is just coming out, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, and I really encourage you to do so. But you can get it in hardcover, you can get it in Kindle. Of course, we also have a link to your website, anthonydistefano.com, and people don't have to know how to spell your name or anything. All they do is click the link next to your picture. As they go there, they're going to find all sorts of books that you have published over the years. And if they wanted to follow you, we have a link both to your Twitter account and to your Facebook account. But just for a minute, talk about what's available on your website when people land there.
Well, this is my 18th book, actually, that's come out. I've written 4 other books for adults, The Travel Guide to Heaven, The 10 Prayers God Always Says Yes To, Angels All Around Us, and The Travel Guide to Life. And I've written a bunch of children's books, some of them actually bigger bestsellers than the adult books.
That's true.
Like The Donkey That No One Could Ride, which is a great book for Easter time. But they're all written for believers and about believers. This book is different, as you said at the outset of the program. This is a much more aggressive, tough book.
But again, it's available. Let me also suggest for those of you that are parents, some great children's books. And even as you're coming to Easter, The Donkey would be a good book, and some of the others. So we'll talk more about that. But let's also open up the phones, give you a chance to join the conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. We have, of course, information about the book Inside the Atheist Mind. We have a link to Anthony DiStefano's website. And then also this article that came out today. Today's atheists are bullies, and they are doing their best to intimidate the rest of us into silence. That, of course, you can find at foxnews.com under their opinion section or a variety of other places where it's posted today. And again, those are resources that are available to you. Now, you might want to take those, quote from them, or post something about that, put it on your Facebook page, put it on your Twitter account, send it to someone else, and that would be able to maybe start a conversation. And, of course, the book's just out, just full of information, and, again, 40 pages almost of endnotes. So if you find yourself saying, well, he says that, but where was that really said, or is that really verifiable? Yeah, you'll find that in the book as well. Let's take a break. We'll take some calls right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. 2 men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters March 23rd. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, as we talk about the new atheists, that'd be Richard Dawkins and Sam Harrison, Daniel Dennett, and when he was alive, Christopher Hitchens. And we're talking with Anthony DiStefano. It is, again, the book Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. It is published by Thomas Nelson. We have information about it on the website. You may be finding it in your local bookstore now that it's coming out, but we've also made it possible for you to order that and to really begin to learn some of the arguments that will be helpful to you if you find yourself interacting with individuals that have been influenced by some of those people. Let's take some phone calls along the way. 1-800-351-1212. We'll head out to Arizona. I think Dave's comment is going to be a good one, listening on KNLB. Dave, what's your point of view?
Well, every time that I've got into a confrontation with an atheist, I always explain to him, I said, you know, you really do believe in God. Number one, you used his name. And number two, you're putting a whole lot of effort into trying to disprove him. So where are you absolutely confused in?
Well, that's a good point. You know, Anthony, Truth Confessions, how much time have you spent over the years trying to refute the existence of Zeus and Thor and maybe Krishna? These individuals spend a lot of time trying to prove that a God doesn't exist that they actually seemingly sort of do believe exists. What about that?
Well, and it's been said that atheism is a creed with two doctrines. Number one, there is no God, and number two, I hate him. So that's the atheist creed. So,
Will, and this I just mentioned in the first hour there, you know, they got a new version coming out of God is Not Dead, and of course you remember in the very first film that was the atheist. I hate God. Well, you don't believe in God, so how can you hate God that you don't believe in God? So, Dave, I think you've got a really good point. Any comments?
Well, one other thing is, I wish everybody would go back and absolutely look at how this country was founded. It is founded on a religious freedom. Nobody forces anybody to believe in God. Nobody forces anybody to go to church, and nobody forces you to pray. So please don't tell me I can't. We've created a society where everybody is offended and they think they get their way. Well, we've backed down and we are giving them their way. Well, I'm offended.
That's a good point.
Let me have my way.
You know, let me come to you that for just a minute, Anthony, because Dave's got a good point there, because we sometimes talk on our Friday weekend edition about religious liberty. Oftentimes we have Kelly Shackelford here, sometimes a Jay Sekulow, whoever it might be, but mostly it's Kelly and First Liberty. And it's just amazing how many times we're talking about one of these cases that surface because of Americans United for Separation Church and State or the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And we used to have kind of this, as I said, kind of this apartheid, you know, okay, you're an atheist. If you want to believe atheism, great. We're Christians. We want to be Christians. But now the idea that a secular-minded person can be, quote, offended because I want to pray or I want to allow the motto, in God we trust, to stay on the coins, that's part of this bullying that you talk about in your recent column, isn't it?
That's right, and they're winning. That's the thing. They're winning because of their tactics of intimidation. We know very well that the Founding Fathers never intended there to be no religion, no public expression of religion. All they wanted to do is make sure there wasn't an establishment of a state religion. But they weren't against people expressing their religious beliefs publicly or anywhere else. The Founding Fathers were all believers. They were all committed Christians, as a matter of fact, or most of them were. But this is just an example of this atheistic intolerance. For the last 50 years, there's been a purge of all things religious, mostly Christian, from the public square, to the point where you can't put up manger scenes. You can't even say Merry Christmas. You know, this whole Christmas war that we've been having the last few years. It's preposterous, and it's time we called them out on this nonsense.
Well, and again, you have a whole section here on the Constitution, the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. But you had a real good quote from Mark Levin from his book Men in Black, and he was on the show with us when he wrote that book years ago, in which he said the intensive and concerted effort to exclude references to religion or God from the public places, he says, is an attack on our founding principles in its attempt to bolster a growing reliance on the government, especially the judiciary, as the source of our rights. rights. But if our rights are not unalienable, if they don't come from a source higher than ourselves, then they're malleable at the will of the state, and that's the prescription for tyranny. And you go on to explain that there is a lot more at stake, because what happens, Anthony, sometimes are people to say, well, yeah, they're bullies, and yeah, they're trying to win this, but it really doesn't matter, because ultimately they'll find out that God exists, if not in this last, in the next. But there are consequences. There are political consequences. There are social consequences. And if you don't think so, just look at a court system that no longer believes that rights are inalienable, that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Or look at the public education system, which again teaches young people that you can't talk about religion. So talking about religion or talking about God is like using pornography or profanity in the classroom. And we are teaching a whole generation that secular ideas are preferable to religious and Christian ideas, aren't we?
We certainly are. And what you said about consequences is the most important thing probably in this discussion that we've had. If you don't believe in God, and this is what atheists deny, but it's the truth. If you don't believe in God, you do not believe that there is you do not have a moral compass. You do not have a transcendent reason for believing against killing, nor do you believe that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, so you don't believe that we have infinite dignity. Now, you put those two beliefs in God, those two beliefs together, no transcendent reason not to kill, and human beings don't have infinite dignity, and that is a recipe for a murder. And indeed, when atheists have had control over the last 100 years, as we spoke about before, people die, 150 million deaths. And now, maybe that's not happening now, but it's happening in a different way. This rise of secularism and functional atheism in our society, it's no accident that's gone hand in hand with this rise in the culture of death. 1 billion abortions since 1960, 800,000 suicides, every 13 minutes. Homicides. People are being euthanized in the Netherlands now because they're alcoholics or because they have dementia. I mean, we're killing our problems instead of caring for them compassionately, and that's all tied to this atheist mentality. We have this culture of death, and that's being driven by these unbelievers.
And again, that's chapter 7 in your book, The Death-Centeredness of the Atheist. And whether you look at abortion on one end or euthanasia on the other, you certainly see that. But one other point that might be important to make, and that is I've been talking about how the atheists really reject religion, but they tend to focus in on Christianity, with the exception maybe of Bill Maher, who I think has been an equal grief giver to all religions, including Islam, and has been called Islamophobic. If you look at the titles, and this is in your chapter on the cowardice of the atheists, they really focus on, of course, they have some called God is Not Great, The God Delusion, but most of the time you have books like The American Fascists, The Christian Right in the War on America, Baptizing of America, The Religious Rights Plans for the Rest of Us, Atheist Universe, The Thinking Person's Answer to Christian Fundamentalism, God's Gravediggers, Why No Deity Exists, God Needs to Go, Why Christian Beliefs Fail. They pick one religion, and it almost always is Christianity. Now, we can understand why they avoid Islam, because you might get your head cut off, but there's also just a sense in which they're not just reacting to religion in general, they're really, in a sense, reacting to Christianity in particular, aren't they?
They are, and one of the biggest reasons is that they're simpering cowards. That's the truth. Let's call a spade here. Where are all the books and blogs against Islam? Where are all the articles? Where are all the nasty sayings? How come they're not going around the country making speeches against Islam the way they're making speeches against Christianity? They're afraid. That's why I quote in my book this atheist secular studies teacher, Phil Zuckerman, who said, the only thing that keeps us from criticizing Islam is fear, physical fear. Well, in other words, they believe that Islam is just as much of a threat to their secular values as Christianity, but they're too afraid. Now, there's something very repulsive about that. At least if they went after Islam as much as they went after Christianity, at least you'd be able to respect them a little bit. But they don't. They're cowards, just as they're cowards in everything else. They're afraid. They're afraid of so many things. They're afraid of history. We talked about. They're afraid of rational debate. They're afraid of freedom. That's why they're always trying to use suppression and intimidation to keep down other people's views instead of rational argument. They have a whole culture of cowardice.
Well, again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, we've posted your column today that you can find in foxnews.com. Today's atheists are bullies, and they are doing their best to intimidate the rest of us into silence. If you'd like to know about the book, hardback, Kindle, and I imagine pretty soon you'll be able to get it in paperback as well. And we also have a link to Anthony DiStefano's website, so you've got lots of great information. It's all available at the website pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back, and we'll take some more phone calls. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. News out of Alaska reports that officials on the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly are thinking of ending their practice of prayer prior to their meetings. Assembly member Sean Tackey has said that the move to end pre-meeting prayer is to be inclusive. Since some of the community believe in prayer before meetings and others don't, he says, quote, having a strict policy of separation of church and state excludes no one and includes everyone, unquote. I'm not sure that's the right logic. By excluding legislative prayer, the Assembly is excluding those who believe in such prayers while favoring those who insist upon strict secularity in the public square. To quote Justice Kennedy's majority opinion in Grease versus Galloway, government may not mandate a civic religion that stifles any but the most generic reference to the sacred any more than it may prescribe a religious orthodoxy, unquote. The Supreme Court of the United States has twice explained legislative prayers have a long history and tradition in our country, a tradition meant to lend gravity to the proceedings while acknowledging the role religion plays in the life of our nation. Legislative bodies like this assembly may choose to end their practice of legislative prayer, but they should understand that nothing in the history of our country or the doctrine of our Constitution compels them to do so. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes again as we talk about this new book just coming out, Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. Anthony DiStefano with us. And in the last chapter, The End of the Atheist, you tell two stories, and I want to get to both of them, Christopher Hitchens and Anthony Flew. Christopher Hitchens, as some of our listeners